we were ready to go. We'd seen success in 5 or 6 countries already, and all the right dynamics were in place for us to say, this is going to be a successful launch. And it wasn't. It was a disaster. And despite a lot of effort and work that went into it, what I came to at the end of it, when I looked at what went wrong, it's like, hang on, what went wrong here? The conditions seemed right. The strategy seemed solid. We had enough flexibility in it to allow for local execution. And I'll tell you what went wrong is that the people on the ground didn't believe in it. And no matter how many examples we shared with them, no matter how much we showed them, hey, it worked in Kenya, it worked in Malawi, you guys are ready for it, they just didn't believe it. But what I did learn was this: don't force products and strategies on a team that is not thoroughly convinced.
Welcome to the How to Not Execute Your Strategy podcast. I'm your host, Tim Ohai. This podcast is dedicated to the biggest lessons learned from the people who own strategic execution, the senior leaders who live in the center of it. My guest today is Chris Hall, the Senior Vice President and General Manager of East and West Africa for Colgate-Palmolive. See the show notes for more information about Chris and to also get access to the leader guide for this episode. Let's get to it. Chris, welcome to the podcast. I'm delighted that you were able to make time all the way in Johannesburg. Here I am on literally the other side of the world. I'm so glad you're able to join us today.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And yes, we are literally 12 hours apart. So good evening to you. Good morning to me.
It's crazy. I tell people in South Africa, I say, look, you need to fly all the way to California and then go another 3,000 plus kilometers over only water. And then you find my little island in the middle. With that said, I put your bio in the introduction, but if you'll give us 2 sentences, just explain your role in the company and what you do in Johannesburg.
Thanks, Tim. So I work for Colgate-Palmolive. Many people know the company. We've got an amazing footprint globally. I've been with the company 24 years. Yes, it still happens. People have long and successful careers in one company. And that's because I've had multiple experiences, 13 different jobs, different continents. I am South African and I'm based here in Johannesburg. And I'm currently the Senior Vice President and General Manager for the East West Africa business, which is essentially sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. So I've got 39 countries in my portfolio. It is an exhilarating space. So yeah, I'm excited to share with you some of the learnings of managing that complexity this morning.
That's massive, actually. 39 countries and a huge continent. I mean, people admittedly on this side of the pond, they think of Africa as one nation. And I'm like, no, it's much bigger. But when you talk about having to execute a strategy in that kind of environment, you're dealing with multiple legal systems, multiple cultural values, multiple languages. What are some of the big things, before we dive into the core interview, some of the big rocks that you constantly have to navigate in that role?
So I think some of the main pillars of success when you're navigating so much complexity, so much diversity, is first of all to find commonality in that diversity. One of the challenges is every country says, oh, we're different. Well, guess what? Every region within that country says they're different. There's different tribes. There's different languages. Just Kenya alone has got more than 47 tribes, right? So you've got one country, multiple tribes. Sometimes it can be overwhelming with the amount of diversity and complexity that you deal with. But if you dig a little deeper, there's some human truths that underline basically everyone across the continent. And so for me, one of the important things is understanding what are some of those human truths. Where can we align? Where can we find areas of commonality? And let's focus on that versus being distracted by all the small things which make us different. It doesn't mean you discard those. Those are important to understand, but it's a delicate balance. And leveraging that as a primary part of your strategy and your thrust to make sure that you can get alignment. You can't customize everywhere. That would be nice, but it's not practical.
That's cool. So the big question, and it's coming, tell us about a time where you had a strategy to execute and it did not go as planned.
Yeah, as I reflected on that question, there was a time a few years ago where we had a strategy which, in fact, the strategy wasn't poor. The strategy was quite solid, but the error came in the execution. And what was interesting about it is that at head office here, sitting here with my directors, we believed the strategy was firm. Okay, we believed that it was robust enough, and as I said, it had enough commonality in it to be rolled out across multiple countries in Africa. And we had actually started to roll it out in a few countries, and it seemed great success. And we felt we could copy, paste, we could adjust for some local nuances, and we could execute, because this has been pretty much our mantra. Take the core strategy, allow enough flexibility to adapt for local circumstances, and off you go. And this particular market, we were ready to go. We'd seen success in 5 or 6 countries already, and all the right dynamics were in place for us to say, this is going to be a successful launch. And it wasn't. It was a disaster. Was it a
product or a brand? What was the launch?
Yeah, it was a product launch. And despite a lot of effort and work that went into it, what I came to at the end of it, when I looked at what went wrong, it's like, hang on, what went wrong here? The conditions seemed right. The strategy seemed solid. We had enough flexibility in it to allow for local execution. And I'll tell you what went wrong is that the people on the ground didn't believe in it.
Really?
My own team didn't believe in it. And so cerebrally, hey, this is going to work. But practically, the team on the ground wasn't convinced. And no matter how many examples we shared with them, no matter how much we showed them, hey, it worked in Kenya, it worked in Malawi, you guys are ready for it, they just didn't believe it. And the error we made was that we forced something. As a leadership team, you have this tension moment where you say, okay, what point is this team just being stubborn? Okay, not seeing the bigger picture, because guess what? We're seeing the bigger picture. Or at what point are they not being given a voice to express, actually, there's some things in the local market that make us believe that this is not going to succeed. Now, to this day, I don't know whether it was, if I'm really honest, I don't know whether it was the team on the ground stubbornness that made it fail, or whether there was truly an intrinsic issue with the product that made it fail. But what I did learn was this: don't force products and strategies on a team that is not thoroughly convinced.
That's huge. There's a couple things I want to step on. First one, the story itself. Did you think you had to just simply tell it to people and they'd buy in? Or did you think that the story had already been tested and people had already started nodding their heads, and so you thought that would just continue? What was going on in your head when you were trying to communicate the narrative?
I think sometimes you have this bias, right? In terms of thinking, okay, I'm telling a story, I'm convinced that this is going to work. And the team that you're looking at has a bit of a blank stare at you. Okay. And you have to reflect as a leader and say, am I creating the conditions to ask enough questions? Perhaps in that circumstance, we weren't. We were noticing sort of the skepticism on their faces, but not probing further. And secondly, it's a tension point in that often as a leader, you're going to bring something slightly controversial to the party. If you keep doing the same thing that you've always done before, you're going to get the same result. We all know that. So as a leader, you're trying to push the envelope. Your ideas are not always going to be perfectly accepted by the team that's executing, because there is a tension in it. You know, you go in a slightly different direction. You're looking to unlock a slightly different target market with this. It's not the same target market that you're comfortable with. It's a fine balance of trying to push your team, okay, but also get the feedback and try to pivot where they bring relevant concerns to the party. In the past, we used to try to convince people both through the data that we had selected and through case studies. So here's what the data says. And in this example, here's how well the team in Kenya executed it. We believe it's going to be a success. What I've done subsequently to overcome this is, if I'm still getting resistance, if I'm still receiving skepticism, I first of all dive deeper with the team to understand, is their fear grounded in a true belief? Is it just grounded in the fear of change? And if it's more a fear of change, then instead of trying to convince them from afar, I've invited them to a market where they've had success, and then as a leader stepping out of the conversation. Let them talk directly to the teams on the ground that executed. And when they start to talk to those teams, the teams say, you know what, we also had some skepticism. This was a little off strategy. This was a different target audience. By the way, we were also a little uncomfortable, but even though we had some discomfort. These are the actions we took. And what I found is in 90% of those cases, those teams that were skeptical leave convinced. And that's because they're not hearing it from a leader sitting 5,000 miles away. They're hearing it from a peer in another market. Now, there are those moments where you come to conclusion that the conditions are completely different and you should rather walk away from it. But I find that those are in the minority.
That's awesome. So in the way that I teach strategic execution, the very first thing I try to get people to nail down is what's the scope of this strategic change? Are we optimizing or are we transforming? If we're optimizing, we're trying to minimize disruption. And if we're transforming, we're actually going to generate disruption. And that I find is the biggest resistance people have to taking ownership of a strategy or whatever the initiative is, that if it's going to generate disruption for their life and they're not a disruptive type of leader, actually they've built their reputation on stabilizing everything and they're really good at managing, they're not necessarily great at changing everything. So it sounds like what you do is your example is definitely a change. It was definitely disruptive to folks. But at the same time, it also sounds like it wasn't as disruptive as they thought it was going to be. And so you were pulling back some of the pressure rather than shoving it into their face. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. I think the only thing I would also add to it is that at the end of the day, unless you're doing a whole reorganization or creating massive organizational disruption, you can learn to isolate these variables, right? We still have a core business. It's still managing well. In this example, we were introducing something. So team, the stop loss strategy on this is, even if it fails in a vacuum, right? We've limited the downside risk. What have you got to lose? Let's continue to focus on our core business while we try something different, right? You don't have to fear that we're throwing out our culture. We're completely changing the direction.
What you just said sounds very reasonable. But at the same time, I have seen, I don't care what industry, everything from retail to tech to finance to manufacturing, I've seen the same reactions across the line of people who just, they almost hyperventilate when they start hearing about what's coming. And you just said, look, we still have our core business. We're going to continue to do that. We're going to make a change. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, no harm, no foul. We'll continue to go forward. Why do you think people fight that?
I think there's different levels through the organization that are either accustomed to change or not accustomed to change. And I think when the change or disruption you're bringing is impacting an individual who's not accustomed to change or to change management, I think that's where the tension comes in. And a different story, we once did quite a different change to the organization. It required a big disruption. And the strategy we adopted there was, again, to bring everybody together. And I remember sitting at the time thinking, this is a big expense. We're flying people from all over the continent to one place to have a meeting, really. We got a third party in as well, who came in as a soundboard, and we had a 2-day workshop. And mainly it was listening. Right, listening and working through the fears and hearing the collective concerns of what the change was. And I think what I learned from that is that people walked away, they came in with a perception that the magnitude of the change was going to be so enormous that they were not able to handle it. That's what they came in with. Once they managed to talk about it, just through the sort of osmosis of having the conversation, they realized that it wasn't as hairy and scary as they initially thought. And I think people discount how much change they go through in their day-to-day lives already. All around them, there's change. There's the way in which you do banking, the way in which, even on the continent here, we've seen how you're banking through cellular phones and no longer cash. There's so many, we could spend a whole hour talking about the amount of change we've gone through over the last 5 years. But people don't think about that. I think people are more adapted on average to be able to manage change than they realize. But when you bring it as a leader, there's this, what aren't they telling me? Maybe the issue is trust to some extent. So often there is an underlying fear that says, I hear what you're saying, but what are you not saying? in bringing this disruption? Is it going to impact me negatively?
That's a really important point, because your culture will become I'll call it the anchor point for how far your strategy can go, right? So if your culture rejects the change, the change will never get off. Even if it was the right approach, the right strategy, the right leaders, the right resource, everything was there. Culturally, just people don't buy in. How do you teach your leaders to do that? How do you get your leaders to become good at this? Hey, if you're enjoying this conversation, I want to encourage you to go to timohai.com/blog now and get the leader guide. It's an awesome way to allow me to both coach you personally through deeper reflection and to also open up the dialogue with your team. All right, back to the interview.
I think, Tim, there's a couple of things I try to do, right? I say try because I won't claim to have mastered these things. But first of all, I think this consistency in your strategy is key, right? If I'm saying the same thing continuously, it takes time to filter through the organization. So I think as leaders, sometimes what happens is we spend a lot of time thinking about our strategy. I know there's been moments where we looked at a strategy, we took 6-7 months. By the time we were finished with it, we were exhausted. Okay. But we hadn't even launched it to anybody in the organization. And so we were tired of it before it had even launched. If we're honest, that often happens, right?
Yeah.
But now you've got to muster up the strength to say, okay, we're going to go and launch this as if it's something fresh and brand new. And we're going to have to make sure that it filters through the organization. The first thing is have a clear strategy that has longevity. Secondly, you're going to get tired of talking about it. So just get used to that. Every time you're talking about it, every forum you're in, it's going to take multiple touch points for it to go through the organization. When you and I met recently, I was sharing with you how proud I was of one of the recent surveys we did where sort of 95% of the team said, I know what our strategy is and I feel connected to the organization. And it really resonated with me because some of my staff is 5,000 miles away. And I was on a trade visit once. Here I am in a dusty street in a town, which was 100 miles even from the main city in that country. And I was talking with somebody who was taking sales orders. And as I was talking to them, at one point they paused and said, can I tell you something? I said, sure. I said, you know, what my boss tells me is what his boss tells him is what his boss tells her. And you've come all the way down here and you're saying the same thing. So I feel quite affirmed that I'm doing the right thing. And that was a real moment for me to say what we're doing, what we're saying is filtering all the way through the organization. So it takes those ingredients. And then what you asked about is your team. So my direct team, how do we make sure that they are also not only sticking not to the script, but that they believe in what we do, is that we meet frequently as a team. We meet in person. We make sure we meet in person. And I think for me, what's important is to constantly find some tension or ways of pushing your team, right? So recently we had a big presentation and I decided, you know what, we're just too comfortable. We're used to a certain style. We're going to shake it up. And I remember briefing my leadership team and the looks on their faces are like, I don't know about this. And I could see the tension was, on one hand, okay, we know you well enough. You've built up enough trust in our reservoir that we trust you. But what you're saying is uncomfortable. And so when you've got this tension of, I have built up trust, then I can introduce some level of discomfort, disruption. If you can get that tension right, then people will move forward with you. They will step out of their comfort zone because they trust you. And so I find myself often asking,
is that because they feel that the trust is also coming with transparency? And so you're, to a degree, you're like, look, hey, I'm not trying to smooth things over. I'm trying to prepare you to be successful on this journey. And that's a different mindset, right? If I know I've got to cross a desert, it's not going to be fun. And yet I know I've been equipped to do it well, as opposed to, oh, it's like a big beach. It's beautiful. Take an umbrella and some drinks and some sunscreen to have a great time, right? So it almost sounds like you're pulling back away from making it sound easy. And yet at the same time, you're leaning in on support and empowerment with your team. Is that right?
Yeah, Tim, I think that's a great difference, right? Don't try to sell it to your team. Get the collective wisdom of the team. Be honest with your team. I've had to learn to say sorry or I've made a mistake frequently. And for me, as a leader, I need to make a lot of decisions and many times fast and many times with not all the information. And I generally, the style I've adopted is to tell people why I'm making a decision. Okay, based on these sets of facts, I'm making this choice. you know what? I've gone back 2 days later and say, the facts have changed. I'm changing my choice. And I hope my team doesn't think I can't make up my mind. But as I've gone down that journey, I've found that works because I'm just showing I'm human like you. Let us get the collective wisdom of the team. Let's not, as you say, describe this as a beach. It's not a beach, it's a desert. But let's agree on why it's important to cross this desert. What is it going to take? What are the risks that we can identify? How can we mitigate those? What is the benefit on the other side? Because it's going to be hard. But what are the benefits for all of us on the other side? And I think those ingredients help you to bring your team along with you on that journey. And people are smart. Hopefully they're smart. Hopefully you've got smart people working for you, right? So trying to sell them on selling stories, for me, insults their intellect. It's acknowledging where the difficulties lie and then collectively working through things. And there are times, I will say, there are times you don't fully agree. And you have to say as a leader, we don't fully agree, but I'm making this choice. And as long as it's not coming across as an autocratic ruler, but it's, look, we're not all going to have full alignment on this, but based on the balance of probabilities, I'm making this choice. Because as a leader, you still got to make a choice. It can't be 100% everybody agrees to go in the same direction. So, sorry, we've gone a little off topic there.
It's not off topic at all, actually. And so I want to take from that point where you've got this, we'll call it this robust dialogue that still comes with one decision maker. You need to have somebody who says, as air pilots will say, who's got the stick? I've got the stick. Okay. I'm not going to fight you over that. So there has to be one person. But with that said, there's got to be probably 2 or 3 qualities that everybody in the organization needs to have in order to thrive in an environment where decision making is still going to have to be shared amongst everyone, because everybody has to make the right decision in their market with their team or with their customer. Maybe they're absolutely 100% frontline. They've got to make the right decision with the customer. So what are those 2 or 3 qualities that you want everybody to have so that you maintain this beautiful 95% alignment around what the strategy is and what people are actually doing?
I think I might sum it up in 2 words. One would be attitude and the other one would be maturity. Right. Ooh. So, famous Zig Ziglar, your attitude determines your altitude. I still love that. I read that 30 years ago. I still believe it. As long as you've got baseline competency to do your job, your attitude is the thing that's really going to define how high you're going to go and how far you're going to lead your team. And secondly is trying to develop a team with a level of maturity and respect. Maybe I can use those 2 words interchangeably, but when I say maturity, as a group having a mature perspective to say, okay, this is not about me protecting my fiefdom. It's about how am I looking at this from a mature standpoint, a leadership standpoint, and breaking down the silos and say, well, what is the big picture that we're all marching towards here? Not, oh my goodness, this means my department's suddenly going to come under pressure, or I have disproportionate stress in this disruption. I think that requires maturity to say, okay, look, even if my department is taking on additional stress through this change that you're proposing, you'll find a way. I trust you. There's a maturity that we can say we will rebalance resources and make sure that will happen. But let's stick together on the focus on keeping the main thing the main thing.
When you talk about attitude and maturity, I immediately think of 2 big concepts. The first one is engagement, right? So engagement is, I believe it's the right thing for the company and for me. And if I believe it's the right thing for the company and for me, I shouldn't see so much fiefdom fighting and in-house conflict because I'm trying to work for the collective. The second one I see is demotivation. If the environment is demotivating, in other words, I'm trying to do the job, but I'm not empowered to do it, and nobody's helping me, I've got too much information coming at me from all different directions, or I've got no information coming to me at all, or it's just I think it's unrealistic, all of that's going to impact my engagement. So when you talk about people who buy in and voluntarily choose a right attitude, because I can destroy an attitude by taking away their empowerment and demotivating them, and voluntarily choose maturity, who seek to bring a mature attitude and respect to the dialogue. Again, I can take that away by taking away resources, taking away people support. I can even throw in a lack of clarity and things will go sideways almost immediately. How do you protect your organization from those diseases affecting the attitude and the maturity you're going to need?
Yeah, I think as a leader, it takes some level of sensitivity to probe a little bit and to try to reassure and understand where their concern lies. I'm not saying you need to become their psychologist, but I think you do need to spend a few minutes just understanding, do we have a real issue here, or do you just need some time to digest this? Do you just need to think it through? Why don't you think it through, and then let's come back and identify those one or two areas that you want to deal with. Secondly, the kind of environment you just described, where people start protecting themselves, is very dangerous. Where they start to saying, oh, what's in it for me? Oh my, I need to punish people by taking away resources. That kind of attitude doesn't sit well with me at all. I need a leadership team that's got a servanthood mindset that says, I'm here, I'm privileged to be in this position. How do I serve my team? How do I, and when I mean serving, how do I create an environment where they can thrive? How can I empower them? How can I give them the ability to make the right choices? And depending on where you are in the organization, it's going to mean different things, because empowerment inherently comes with accountability. It's not just empowerment without accountability. So how do you walk with your team to say, I'll give you more empowerment, but it comes with a certain level of accountability. We still got to maintain a level of control in our organization. But depending on where you are, I think that's really important to start to create an environment where people are empowered, give them the resources they require to do their jobs, and let them be. But you've got to make sure, put your manager hat on every now and then, and you have the right check-ins with them to make sure that they are actually on the track that you expected. And to be honest, 90% of the time I found that people run with it. They genuinely want to demonstrate that they've got leadership capabilities to run the project, but it does take a little bit of time and a little bit of sensitivity to understand, okay, what is the specific needs and how can I address that? For me, I find the challenge is even just in communication. So how do we make sure that we're understanding first what their issues are? And also, sometimes I'm wrong, right? The way in which the law is interpreted in a different country, it seems bizarre to me, but I'm wrong.
So you've got to be flexible. You've got to be humble. You've got to be alert. And I'll use the word you used repeatedly, sensitive. Are there situations where even that doesn't work?
I think there are situations that doesn't work. That's my preferred style. It's almost, you've got to have this balance of being, how do I say this? What I've learned as a leader is, how do I develop a thick skin but keep a soft heart, right? Because you got to have a thick skin for this. You got to have a strong backbone for some of the things you got to deal with. But what I've found is that your style has to adjust slightly for different people, okay? And not everybody who works for you is the same as you. That's a good thing, by the way.
That's a great thing.
But it also means that sometimes some people can deal with more empowerment, some can deal with less. Your style, even the way you communicate. So I think you've got to just adjust based on either their preferred style or also just take into account the circumstances. The point is, I still want to get the same message across, but I may just have to pivot a little bit in terms of how I do that to optimize how that lands.
So that's the key. The key is you're going to still deliver the message. The message has to be delivered, and at least it has to be understood. And then if it's still resistance, that's an entirely different conversation than executing a strategy.
Correct. Then you get to a crossroads, right?
Yeah.
I think as a leader, you've got to say, okay, I want to be flexible, but 80% of me is a little bit inflexible. Like, this is my strategy. This is the core. These are the things we're doing. I will allow some flexibility around that. I don't want to be a reed that just flops around, right? But I also don't want to be an iron rod that has no flexibility. But I would say if you were to think of it proportionately, 80% of what you say has got to be consistent, but you allow a little bit of flexibility. Now, if you come up against resistance against that, then you've hit a crossroads and you've got to say, okay, what's the source of that resistance? How do I solve it? And then, Tim, sometimes it is people. You've got to be honest. We hate to admit it, but there are sometimes, that's a tougher conversation. That's for a different day. But there are moments where you come up against individuals who just are not willing to move and to change. And sometimes their run within the organization, within that space, has also come to an end. But that's a much harder thought process to work through.
And I would just, as an added commentary to anyone listening, If you are that person who's just can't get behind the strategy, you do have permission to leave. Frankly, don't stay on a team that you don't believe in the game plan. Leave, get out of there, because you're not happy. They're not happy. The strategy is not going to work. And ultimately, the people you're trying to serve are not happy.
What I loved about what you just said is that there's some times where there's just the wrong fit. And I've even had conversations with people to say, look, you're really good at what you do, but this is the wrong fit for you. And that person said, you know what, I feel the same way. It doesn't mean I could get out the door tomorrow, but I've still stayed in touch with and been friends with people that have worked with me. We got to a point where we just had an honest conversation and said, you know what, where you're going is no longer my strength. And it's time for me to find another company in a different direction. And that's okay. We just have to be honest about that moment as well.
That's well said. That's well said. Chris, thank you so much for your time. There's so much in here that folks can walk away with, and I'm delighted that you were able to share from literally the other side of the world. But it's all the same stuff, and it's universal truths that apply no matter where you are in the world. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Tim. Great to chat to you today.
I hope you enjoyed that episode and have some solid takeaways. Here are 3 that I want to highlight. 1, change management is a skill set that everyone needs in order to both lead and follow change. Strategic efforts will always produce change, and that change will either cause your team to thrive or bog everything down. 2, slow down to let your leaders talk through the strategy before it executes. Allow them time to get their heads and hearts into alignment with what is about to launch. This gives you both the benefit of collecting their insights about how to improve the execution and also to get their full buy-in. 3, sometimes your people will not accept the change required by the strategy. When that happens, have the courage to address it head on. Talk it through with that person. And if necessary, be prepared to talk about an exit strategy with that player. If you enjoyed this episode, there are 3 things that I would ask of you. First, please share it with at least one person. Second, hit those rating stars on whatever platform you downloaded this podcast. When you do that, it raises the visibility of what we are talking about to people just like you. Third, follow me on LinkedIn and Meta, especially on Instagram at Tim_Ohai. You'll get even more content that will both challenge and inspire you. Holomua. Onward and upward.